Tonight we're going somewhere very far away. We're drifting west, across thousands of miles of open ocean, past the fatting edge of the Hawaiian Islands, past the international date line, out toward the deepest water on Earth, to a small, green island called Guam. A place most people couldn't find on a map, yet one that strategic planners, admirals, and foreign ministers have studied with intense focus for more than a century. A place where the past and future of Pacific power keep coming back to meet each other, in the shadow of limestone cliffs and the hum of jet engines. We're going to take our time tonight. We're going to trace the long arc of this island's story, its ancient people, its colonial centuries, its transformation into one of the most significant military outposts on the planet. We're going to explore the deep currents of geopolitical tension in the Pacific, the relationship between the United States and China, what nuclear deterrence actually means for the world, and why an island of about 210 square miles, smaller than the city of Chicago, sits at the very center of so many calculations about what a future conflict in Asia might look like, and why the world works so hard to make sure one never happens. This is an exploration of history, strategy, and the deep logic of international relations. It is a peaceful, reflective journey. We will discuss real events, real geography, and real military theory, carefully and calmly. Where we venture into hypothetical territory, I will always tell you. And throughout, we will remain what we always are here at Future Slumber, a quiet voice in the dark, helping you understand the world and then letting you drift off to sleep. Breathe slowly, let your body sink a little deeper, and let's begin. Part 1. An island at the edge of the world. The island of Guam sits at 13 degrees north latitude and 144 degrees east longitude. To put that in terms your resting mind can picture easily, it is roughly 1/4 of the way between the Philippines and Hawaii, floating in an enormous expanse of Pacific water. San Francisco is about 5,800 miles to the east. Manila in the Philippines is around 1,500 miles to the west. Tokyo is approximately 1,500 miles to the north. Guam occupies a position that cartographers might describe as a crossroads, the only major island with both a protected natural harbor and land large enough for multiple airfields sitting on the east-west axis between Asia and Hawaii, and on the north-south axis between Japan and Papua New Guinea. The island itself is not large. It covers approximately 210 square miles, making it roughly 3 times the size of Washington, D.C. In shape, it is somewhat like an elongated oval, wider and flatter in the north, rising into volcanic hills in the south. The northern portion rests on a coralline limestone plateau, thickly forested, sitting about 500 feet above sea level. The southern half of the island is geologically older, volcanic, steeper, covered in a mixture of dense jungle and stretches of sword grass that sway in the northeast trade winds. The highest point is Mount Lamlam in the southwest, rising to 1,332 feet, high enough that on a clear day, sailors on ships far out to sea can make it out as a dark line on the horizon. Surrounding the island is a coral reef system that shelters most of the coastline. The western shore is leeward, protected from the dominant wind, and it is there that Apra Harbor sits, one of the finest natural harbors in the entire western Pacific, deep enough for the largest naval vessels, sheltered enough for safe anchorage in most weather. On the eastern side, the ocean swells arrive in long, unbroken lines from thousands of miles of open Pacific, and the beaches are strewn with the fine white sand of crushed coral. The deep water just to the east and south of Guam reaches into something almost mythological in scale, the Mariana Trench, the deepest place on the surface of the Earth. The Challenger Deep, located southwest of the island, descends to approximately 35,797 feet, almost 7 miles of black, cold, crushing water. The islands of the Mariana Chain, of which Guam is the southernmost and largest, were created as a result of the same geological drama, the Pacific Plate slowly subducting beneath the Philippine Sea Plate, building a volcanic arc above the collision zone. Guam itself, though not volcanically active today, owes its very existence to tens of millions of years of geological violence beneath the sea. The air above Guam is warm and humid year-round. Temperatures rarely stray far from the mid-80s Fahrenheit. The northeast trade winds moderate the heat, and there are two seasons, a relatively dry season from January through June, and a wet season from July through December, when typhoons occasionally move through the region. These storms, when they come, can be ferocious. Typhoon Karen in 1962 and Typhoon Olive in 1963 devastated much of the island. The memory of typhoons is woven into the local experience of living here, much as earthquakes are for those who live along active fault lines. The population of Guam in 2022 was approximately 168,000 people, a small, densely packed community on a small island, vibrant and diverse. The largest village is Dedido, in the north-central portion of the island. The capital, Hagetnya, also written Agana, sits on the western coast, facing the harbor. It is worth pausing on the name of that capital. Hagetnya comes from the Chamorro word Haga, meaning blood, a reference, according to some scholars, to the bloodlines of the various families who first established settlements there. That etymology carries a certain weight. Blood, lineage, belonging, these are the themes that run beneath the surface of everything that has happened on this island. Part 2. The people who were here first. The Chamorro people, or Si Hamoru, in the spelling preferred today by many on the island, first arrived on Guam somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 years ago. They came from the Malay archipelago and neighboring island regions, related through language and ancestry to the Austronesian peoples who spread across the vast Pacific and Indian Ocean world over millennia. They were skilled navigators, farmers, and fishermen, and they built a civilization of considerable sophistication. At the peak of Chamorro society before European contact, the island supported between 35,000 and 50,000 people, a very dense population for an island of this size, living in an estimated 180 villages spread across both the coastal lowlands and the interior hills. The Chamorros developed a rich material culture, including the latte stones that remain one of the most striking archaeological features of the Mariana Islands. These are carved limestone pillars, often topped with hemispherical caps, used as foundation supports for the homes of high-status families. They range from a few feet to over 20 feet in height, and they have survived for centuries as silent sentinels in forests and along old village sites. There is something deeply moving about them, the physical evidence of a people who built and lived and organized their society around ideas of family, prestige, and community, long before any European ship ever crossed their horizon. That horizon was crossed in 1521, when Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the Marianas during his circumnavigation of the globe. His visit was brief and troubled. There was conflict with the local population almost immediately, partly the result of cultural misunderstanding about the nature of trade and ownership. Magellan named the islands the Ladrones, meaning thieves, though this is a label that says more about the clash of two radically different conceptions of property than about any moral failing of the Chamorro people. The formal Spanish colonization of Guam began in 1668, when Jesuit missionaries led by Father Diego Luis de Sanviters arrived and established the first permanent European settlement. Spain had claimed the island more than a century earlier. Miguel López de Legazpi had formally claimed it for the crown in 1565, but colonization came late and was, from the perspective of the Chamorro people, catastrophic. The Spanish-Chamorro Wars, which lasted from roughly 1672 to 1695, marked a period of sustained and devastating conflict. The Chamorro people resisted the disruption of their society, the imposition of Christian religious practice, and the Spanish policy of reducción, the forced consolidation of the population into a small number of centralized towns, breaking up the traditional village structure. The resistance was fierce, but the combination of European weapons, military organization, and most devastatingly, introduced diseases against which the Chamorro had no immunity, caused a catastrophic population collapse. From an estimated 35,000 to 50,000 people at contact, the Chamorro population fell to perhaps as few as 1,800 by the early 18th century, a loss of more than 90% in less than a century. This is one of the most severe demographic collapses in the entire history of European colonialism, and it shaped everything that followed. The survivors were gathered into a handful of settlements under close Spanish supervision. Their language, though it survived and is still spoken today, absorbed hundreds of Spanish words and Spanish grammatical influences. Their culture adapted, blended, and endured, but it was changed forever. For the next 2 centuries, from 1668 to 1898, Guam served Spain as a way station in the Pacific. The galleons of the Manila trade route, the great silver ships sailing between Acapulco in Mexico and Manila in the Philippines, stopped at Guam for fresh water and provisions. The island was administered, somewhat neglectfully, from the Philippines. It was a colonial backwater in the eyes of Madrid, useful for its harbor and its geographic position, not otherwise of great concern. The Chamorro people lived under this arrangement, governed by a naval administration that controlled their movements, their religion, and their civic life, gradually rebuilding their numbers and their communities. Then in the summer of 1898, the world changed. Part 3. The American Century begins. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was a conflict that lasted only a matter of months but reshaped the map of the Pacific world. When the United States declared war on Spain in April of that year, its focus was primarily Cuba and the Philippines, but Guam, as a Spanish possession, was also a target. In June 1898, the USS Charleston arrived off the coast of Guam and fired a series of shots at the Spanish fort at Apra Harbor. The Spanish garrison, which had not yet received news that their nation was at war, initially thought the shots might be a salute. They had no ammunition to return the gesture, and sent a boat out to apologize for this shortcoming. The misunderstanding was quickly cleared up when U.S. naval officers explained the situation. The Spanish garrison surrendered the island without a fight. Captain Henry Glass of the U.S. Navy accepted the surrender. The entire operation took less than a day. Under the Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, Spain ceded Guam to the United States, effective April 11, 1899. Along with Guam, Spain also ceded Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Cuba was granted independence under American supervision. The Spanish Empire, which had once stretched across 2 hemispheres, was effectively ended in a matter of months. For Guam, the change of colonial masters brought new realities but not immediate liberation. The United States placed the island under naval administration, the naval station Guam, and the Chamorro people found themselves governed by a series of naval governors who were appointed by Washington and operated with considerable autonomy. The Chamorros were American nationals but not American citizens. They could not vote in federal elections. They had limited self-governance. Their petitions for citizenship were repeatedly denied in the early decades of American rule. The naval administration did invest in infrastructure, roads, schools, sanitation systems, a hospital. English became the language of education and commerce. The Navy worked to develop Apra Harbor as a strategic coaling station and port for ships traveling between Hawaii and the Philippines. And slowly, the island was knitted into the emerging web of American strategic thinking about the Pacific, a region that the United States, from the moment it acquired Hawaii in 1897 and the Philippines in 1898, understood it needed to dominate. The Organic Act of 1950, passed in the years after World War II, finally granted United States citizenship to the Chamorro people of Guam. This was a momentous change, long sought and long delayed. but it came with a peculiarity that persists to this day. Guamanians are full American citizens, holding American passports, subject to federal law, eligible to serve in the U.S. military, and they do so at remarkable rates, with Guam producing more military veterans per capita than virtually any state in the Union. But they cannot vote in presidential elections unless they establish residency on the mainland. It is a constitutional arrangement that reflects Guam's status as an unincorporated territory, a legal category with deep historical roots in the post-1898 expansion of American power. There is a quiet complexity here that deserves a moment of reflection, even at this late and gentle hour. The Chamorro people have lived under 4 colonial administrations: Spanish, Japanese during World War II, and American twice over, with a gap of 32 months of brutal occupation in between. Their language, culture, and identity have survived all of it, transformed and resilient. Today, Chamorros constitute approximately 37 to 40% of Guam's population, the largest single ethnic group on the island. Filipinos make up roughly 25%. Mainland Americans, many of them military personnel and their families, account for a significant share as well. The rest of the population is a mix of other Pacific Islanders, Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, and other Asian communities. A genuinely multicultural community on a very small island in a very large ocean. Part 4. The Island in Agony, World War II. The morning of December 8, 1941, arrived on Guam in the way that many terrible mornings arrive, quietly, with the birds calling and the light coming up over the eastern ocean, with no outward sign of what was about to happen. On the other side of the international date line, it was still December 7. The attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, was underway, and because Guam lay west of the date line, the coordinated Japanese strikes on American positions across the Pacific were technically 1 calendar day later on the island, but they began within hours of the Pearl Harbor assault. Japanese aircraft appeared over Guam's horizon, flying in formation, and the bombing began. The Chamorro people, who were in church for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception when the planes first struck, had almost no warning. The island's military garrison was tiny, about 400 American troops, a handful of Marines, and a small naval contingent. Against this, Japan deployed approximately 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. By sunrise on December 10, 1941, after 2 days of air raids and a ground assault, the American naval governor, Captain George McMillan, surrendered the island. It was an overwhelming, inevitable defeat. All American military personnel and most American civilians were taken prisoner and shipped to Japan. The remaining Chamorro population, roughly 21,000 people at the time, found themselves under Japanese occupation. What followed over the next 31 months was one of the most painful chapters in the long history of Guam. The Japanese renamed the island Amiyajima, the island of the imperial court, and set about the systematic Japanization of the population. Chamorros were required to learn the Japanese language, bow before Japanese officers, use Japanese currency, and attend Japanese schools. English was forbidden. Radios, cameras, and cars were confiscated. Food was rationed. As the war turned against Japan in late 1943 and 1944, the treatment of the Chamorro population became progressively more brutal. Japanese soldiers committed massacres in several locations on the island. In the village of Maleso, called Merizo by the Americans, 46 men and women were massacred at sites called Tinta and Faja just days before American forces returned. In the north, the bodies of 51 Chamorros were found mutilated by American patrols after the liberation. 30 men were found beheaded near Chagwian. Others were found in jungles, in ravines, in caves. By the end of the occupation, at least 1,170 Chamorros had died, nearly a tenth of the population. By some estimates, the figure was higher. Every family on the island carries the memory of this time, passed down through generations. The American reconquest of Guam began on July 21, 1944, a date still celebrated annually as Liberation Day. The battle was intense and costly. More than 7,000 American soldiers and Marines died, along with approximately 17,000 Japanese defenders. The fighting lasted more than 3 weeks, with the Japanese ultimately retreating into the jungle, conducting guerrilla resistance that in some cases continued for years afterward. The most famous example is that of Shoichi Yaka, a Japanese soldier who hid in the jungles of Guam for 27 years after the war ended, finally discovered by local hunters in January 1972, still believing that the war continued. It is a story that straddles the boundary between tragedy and surreality. When the Chamorro people emerged from the camps and jungles in the summer of 1944, many had lost everything. 2 of the island's largest villages had been destroyed in the fighting. The physical landscape of Guam had been transformed by bombing, by fortification construction, and by the immense buildup of American military infrastructure that began almost immediately after liberation. The island that emerged from the war was deeply different from the island that had entered it. But one thing had not changed: the Chamorro people's endurance and their remarkable capacity for building a life in the aftermath of devastation. The Liberation Day parades that take place every July 21 are not simply commemorative events. They are an annual act of affirmation, a declaration that the people of Guam survived and continue to be here, with their language, their food, their music, their extended family networks called the clan system, and their distinctive Pacific identity intact. Part 5. The unsinkable aircraft carrier. After the liberation in 1944, the United States wasted no time turning Guam into something it had always threatened to become: one of the most powerful military outposts on Earth. The military buildup that began in 1944 and continued through the Cold War transformed the northern half of the island. In the town of Yigo, on the high limestone plateau, a massive airfield complex was constructed that would eventually become Andersen Air Force Base. Named after Brigadier General James Roy Anderson, who was lost at sea in February 1945, the base was originally called North Field and served as a staging ground for the B-29 Superfortress bombers that carried out the strategic bombing campaign against Japan's home islands in 1944 and 1945. It was from this island, and from adjacent Tinian, that the Enola Gay and Boxcar took off on the missions that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The end of World War II in the Pacific was in a very real sense a Guam-connected event. After the war, Andersen Air Force Base grew steadily in importance. During the Korean War, B-29s from Andersen were among the first aircraft to bomb targets on the Korean peninsula after the North Korean invasion of South Korea in June 1950. During the Vietnam War, Andersen was one of the most operationally significant bases in the entire American military system. In Operation Linebacker II in December 1972, the intensive bombing campaign against North Vietnam that preceded the Paris Peace Accords, approximately 152 of the more than 200 B-52 Stratofortress bombers used in the operation flew from Andersen. It was one of the largest deployments of heavy bombers since World War II, and the scale of operations at Andersen during this period was extraordinary. Today, Andersen Air Force Base covers about 20,000 acres on the northern end of Guam. It has 2 long runways capable of handling every aircraft in the Department of Defense inventory. It holds the largest fuel storage and munitions storage capacity of any U.S. Air Force base in the world. According to the Pacific Air Forces, it is strategically located, with impressive fuel and munitions storage capability. The base's host unit, the 36th Wing, is a non-flying wing whose mission is to support deployed air and space forces from across the U.S. Air Force and from allied nations. But the aircraft that rotate through are among the most formidable in existence. Andersen is described by military analysts as the most important U.S. air base west of Hawaii. It is the only base in the Western Pacific capable of permanently servicing all three of the U.S. Air Force's strategic bomber types: the B-1B Lancer, the B-2A Spirit stealth bomber, and the B-52H Stratofortress. During the period from 2004 to 2020, heavy strategic bombers were maintained at Andersen on what the Air Force called a continuous bomber presence, a permanent rotation of strategic aircraft that sent a constant signal of American reach and commitment to the region. In 2020, the Air Force ended the permanent rotation in favor of a more flexible dispersal strategy, but bombers continue to deploy to Guam on a regular basis. One phrase that comes up repeatedly in discussions of Andersen and of Guam more broadly is unsinkable aircraft carrier. It is a vivid phrase, and deliberately so. An aircraft carrier is a movable airbase, a platform from which aircraft can project power across enormous distances. Guam performs this function from a fixed position in the Western Pacific, but unlike a carrier, it cannot be sunk. Its fuel, its munitions, its repair facilities, its runways, and its personnel are anchored to solid ground. In terms of sheer capacity, Andersen dwarfs anything a conventional aircraft carrier can provide. At the southern end of the island, roughly 30 miles from Andersen, lies Naval Base Guam. This facility includes a deep-water harbor at Apra, the same harbor that has served ships crossing the Pacific since the galleon days, a ship repair yard, communication centers, a naval hospital and support facilities. Together, Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Base Guam form the backbone of American military power in the Western Pacific, a combined installation of extraordinary strategic depth. In 2020, the United States also began developing Marine Corps Base Camp Blaz on Guam, part of a broader realignment of U.S. Marine Corps forces away from Japan's Okinawa Island and toward positions in the second island chain. The U.S. military controls roughly 29% of Guam's total land area, a significant portion of a small island, and a fact that has generated genuine tension over the decades between the federal government and Guamanian residents who feel that the military presence has come at the cost of local autonomy and available land. This is a legitimate grievance, and it reflects the broader complexity of Guam's political situation. A community that has historically expressed strong support for its American identity and connections, while simultaneously living with real constraints on its sovereignty and self-determination. The military presence is, at the same time, the dominant economic reality of the island. Military spending constitutes the largest single source of income and economic stability in Guam. Tourism, primarily from Japan and other Asian countries, is the second major pillar of the economy, with more than 1 million visitors per year in normal times. The two industries coexist somewhat uneasily on an island that is simultaneously a tropical resort destination and the nerve center of American military power in the Pacific. Part 5b, the military geography of a small island. It is worth spending a little more time on the physical and institutional reality of what the American military presence on Guam actually looks like, because the gap between the phrase military base and the reality of what exists there is substantial. Andersen Air Force Base occupies roughly 20,000 acres on the northern limestone plateau. Its two main runways are long enough and strong enough to support every aircraft type in the U.S. military inventory, from the hulking C-5 Galaxy cargo plane to the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The base has hosted rotating deployments of virtually every major American combat aircraft of the past half-century, and during periods of heightened tension, The ramp space on Anderson can look like a museum of American air power, arranged across a vast plateau of white coral limestone. The fuel storage infrastructure at Anderson is, by U.S. Air Force records, the largest at any American air base in the world. This is the logistical heartbeat of American power projection into East Asia. Moving aircraft is relatively quick. Moving fuel is slow, and a base without fuel is a base that cannot operate. The investment in fuel storage at Anderson reflects how seriously American planners take the need to sustain extended operations in the Pacific, far from the continental United States. Similarly, the munitions storage capacity at Anderson is among the Air Force's largest. The caves and hardened bunkers beneath the limestone plateau hold the weapons that would arm the aircraft in any contingency. This depth of stored munitions means American forces operating from Guam can sustain operations for extended periods without resupply from the continental United States, a critical advantage given the distances involved. Naval Base Guam at the southern end of the island at Apra Harbor is a different kind of installation. Where Anderson is an air power base, Naval Base Guam is a maritime power base. The harbor is deep enough to accommodate Lowe's Angels-class and Virginia-class attack submarines, which are homeported there. Nuclear-powered submarines are, in the judgment of most strategic analysts, among the most strategically significant American assets in the Pacific. They are mobile, extremely hard to detect, capable of operating in denied areas, and armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles that give them a significant conventional strike capability. Their presence at Guam means that American submarine forces are already forward deployed in the Western Pacific, reducing the transit time required to get them into operational position in any crisis scenario. The ship repair facilities at Naval Base Guam can maintain and repair the vessels of a carrier strike group, an essential capability given the distance from the continental United States. Keeping ships at sea in the Western Pacific requires the ability to fix them when things break, and the distance from the American West Coast means that flying parts and sending repair teams across the Pacific on a just-in-time basis is not a reliable logistics model. The communications infrastructure at Guam, cables, satellite uplinks, radio arrays, connects the island to the rest of the American military command and control system, and to the global network of undersea communications cables that carry most of the world's internet traffic. In fact, Guam serves as a major hub for the Trans-Pacific Cable Network, with multiple major undersea fiber optic cables landing on the island's shores. The internet traffic of entire nations in Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and across Oceania passes through or near Guam. This gives the island a critical role not just in military communications, but in the global civilian telecommunications infrastructure. Marine Corps Base Camp Blaz, the newest major military installation on Guam, began development as part of a broader rebalancing of Marine Corps forces in the Pacific. The United States and Japan agreed to move several thousand Marines from Okinawa, where political pressure over the American military footprint had become intense, to Guam and other Pacific locations. Camp Blaz, named after Brigadier General Vicente Ben Blaz, a Guamanian Marine general and later congressional delegate from Guam, is being developed on land in the north of the island, adjacent to Anderson. The total American military presence on Guam amounts to several thousand military personnel on active duty, plus their families and the substantial civilian workforce that supports the bases. Together, with military retirees who have chosen to remain on the island, active duty personnel and their dependents account for approximately 1/4 of the island's total population. Military spending is not merely an abstract economic contributor to Guam. It is woven into the daily life of the island in the most immediate ways, employing local residents, supporting local businesses, and providing a guaranteed economic base in a location that would otherwise depend entirely on the cyclical and weather-sensitive tourism industry. Part 6. The Island Chains and the Great Strategic Game. To understand why Guam matters so much to military planners, on both the American and Chinese sides of the Pacific equation, it helps to understand a concept that has shaped strategic thinking in the region since the Cold War: the island chain strategy. The idea was first articulated by American military planners during and immediately after the Korean War. Looking at the geography of the Western Pacific, they identified a series of island arcs that could serve as barriers or gates, controlling movement between the deep Pacific and the Asian coastline. The first island chain runs roughly from Japan's Ryukyu Islands through Taiwan, the Philippines, and onward to the Indonesian archipelago. This chain sits relatively close to the Asian mainland, within easy striking range of land-based aircraft and shorter-range missiles. During the Cold War, the United States built a dense network of military bases along this arc, most notably at Kadena Air Base on Okinawa in Japan. The second island chain lies further out into the Pacific, a line running from Japan's Bonin Islands through the Mariana Chain, including Guam, and curving south toward Palau and eventually to Indonesia. Guam sits squarely on this second chain. The logic of these island chains is both geographic and strategic. They define the operational theater within which the two sides in any Pacific confrontation would have to fight. Forces based on the first island chain in Japan, South Korea, or the Philippines are closer to China, but also more exposed and more easily threatened by Chinese forces. Forces on the second island chain, primarily Guam, are further back, providing greater protection from shorter-range threats while still offering reach across the region. Guam occupies what strategic analysts sometimes describe as a sweet spot. It is roughly 2,000 miles from the Chinese mainland, far enough to make it difficult, but not impossible, for Chinese forces to threaten, while still close enough to serve as an effective platform for American power projection into the Western Pacific. American bombers flying from Andersen can reach the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the Korean Peninsula, and the Sea of Japan within hours. This position has made Guam central to American strategy in the Pacific for 8 decades, and it has made Guam central to Chinese strategic concern for at least the past 2 decades. As China's military capabilities have expanded, and they have expanded dramatically, Guam's position has shifted from being a relatively safe rear base to being a potential frontline target in any major Pacific conflict. The geography of the Pacific is, in essence, the stage on which the largest strategic drama of our time is playing out. Let us take the time to understand the players. Part 7. The long arc of U.S.-China relations. The relationship between the United States and China is one of the most consequential and complicated in the modern world. It has swung through phases of intense hostility, cautious rapprochement, and deep economic interdependence, all within the span of about 75 years. Understanding it requires going back to the moment when the modern relationship began. When Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949, the United States refused to recognize the new government. The nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, driven from the mainland after a devastating civil war, retreated to the island of Taiwan and continued to claim to be the legitimate government of all of China. The United States supported this position. Within a year of the communist victory on the mainland, American forces were fighting Chinese troops in Korea. The Korean War began in June 1950 when North Korea invaded the South, and by October of that year, Chinese forces had crossed the Yalu River and entered the conflict on the North Korean side. American and Chinese soldiers killed each other in the mountains and frozen valleys of the Korean peninsula for the next 3 years, and the Korean War ended in July 1953 with an armistice that left the peninsula divided essentially where it had begun, at the 38th parallel. This bloody, exhausting conflict set the tone for the following 2 decades of U.S.-China relations: deep mutual hostility, no diplomatic recognition, and a strategic standoff across the Pacific. The United States built its network of island chain alliances partly as a containment belt around communist China. China built its military and developed its nuclear program partly in response to the American encirclement. The two countries came to the edge of direct confrontation twice in the 1950s over the small islands of Jinmen and Mazu in the Taiwan Strait, moments known as the First and Second Taiwan Strait crises, and managed to step back both times, but only just. The thaw came in 1972, when President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to Beijing and met with Mao Zedong. This was one of the most significant diplomatic moments of the Cold War era, a rapprochement between two adversaries that had spent 20 years in near-total isolation from each other. Nixon's visit opened a channel that would eventually lead, in 1979, to full diplomatic normalization under President Jimmy Carter. The United States broke its formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, ended its mutual defense treaty with the Republic of China, and shifted recognition to Beijing. This created a delicate arrangement that has persisted ever since. The United States maintains official diplomatic relations only with the People's Republic of China, while simultaneously maintaining what it describes as unofficial relations with Taiwan through the American Institute in Taiwan, an arrangement that is, in practice, equivalent to a diplomatic relationship in all but name. The 1979 Taiwan Relations Act obligated the United States to provide Taiwan with the means for its self-defense and to maintain the capacity to resist any coercive change to Taiwan's status. But it stopped short of a formal defense commitment. The period from normalization through the 1980s and much of the 1990s was characterized by what American strategists called engagement, the theory that integrating China into the global economic and political system would gradually moderate its behavior and encourage political liberalization. China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. American companies invested heavily in Chinese manufacturing. Trade between the two countries expanded enormously. By the 2010s, the U.S. and China were each other's largest trading partners, with hundreds of billions of dollars in goods crossing the Pacific in both directions each year. But tensions never entirely disappeared, and in the 2010s they began accelerating toward a new and more contentious period. China's growing military power, its militarization of artificial islands in the South China Sea, where it claimed sweeping sovereignty over an area encompassing approximately 62% of that strategically critical body of water, and its increasingly assertive posture toward Taiwan, all signaled that the peaceful rise narrative that had characterized Chinese foreign policy in the 1990s and early 2000s was giving way to something more confident and demanding. The accession of Xi Jinping as China's paramount leader in 2012 marked a distinct turning point. Xi consolidated power to a degree not seen since the Mao era, organized a sustained campaign of anti-corruption that doubled as a purge of potential rivals, and articulated a vision of Chinese national rejuvenation, the China Dream, that involved not just economic development, but the recovery of what he described as China's rightful position at the center of the regional and eventually the global order. Under Xi, China's military spending grew substantially, its nuclear arsenal expanded significantly, and its behavior in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, and along its borders with India became considerably more assertive. In 2015, China unveiled the DF-26 ballistic missile at a military parade in Beijing, a weapon that analysts immediately recognized as China's first conventionally armed ballistic missile with the range to strike Guam. Chinese media gave it a blunt nickname, the Guam Killer. The election of Donald Trump as U.S. President in 2016 brought a sharp escalation in trade tensions. In 2018, The Trump administration launched a broad tariff campaign against Chinese goods, targeting steel, aluminum, technology products, and eventually hundreds of billions of dollars in Chinese imports. China retaliated with its own tariffs on American agricultural products and other goods. This trade war, which continued under President Biden with modifications, established a new baseline of economic friction in the relationship. Relations further deteriorated through the pandemic years and into the current decade, marked by disputes over semiconductors and technology transfer, accusations of espionage, tensions over Hong Kong's autonomy, concerns about the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, and an almost uninterrupted escalation of military pressure around Taiwan. As of early 2026, the U.S. and China are engaged in what many analysts describe as a competitive relationship that, while stopping well short of open conflict, involves sustained strategic rivalry across economic, technological, diplomatic, and military domains. Part 8. Taiwan, the center of gravity. No question in the Pacific shapes the strategic environment more fundamentally than Taiwan. Taiwan is a self-governing democracy of approximately 23.3 million people, sitting on an island roughly 100 miles off the southeastern coast of mainland China. It has its own elected government, its own military, its own currency, and its own highly developed economy. It produces, through its TSMC chip foundry and related industries, a substantial portion of the world's most advanced semiconductors, the components that power everything from smartphones to weapon systems to artificial intelligence. Its economic and technological significance is enormous. The People's Republic of China has never controlled Taiwan. The island has been governed continuously by the Republic of China government, first claiming to represent all of China, more recently evolving toward a distinct Taiwanese identity since 1949. A large majority of Taiwan's population now identifies as Taiwanese rather than Chinese, according to polling data. The democratic system, established beginning in the late 1980s, commands broad popular support. Beijing regards Taiwan as a core interest, a territory that is, in its view, an inalienable part of China, separated from the mainland by historical accident and American interference, and destined for eventual reunification. Chinese leaders have repeatedly stated that they prefer peaceful unification but have insisted on their right to use force to prevent permanent separation. The question of Taiwan is described by Chinese officials as the first red line that cannot be crossed in relations with the United States. American policy toward Taiwan is defined by what is called strategic ambiguity, a deliberately vague position designed to deter both Chinese aggression and Taiwanese provocations that might trigger conflict. The United States acknowledges the Chinese position that there is one China but does not endorse it. It does not formally recognize Taiwan's independence. It maintains substantial unofficial relations with Taipei and provides Taiwan with defensive weapons under the Taiwan Relations Act. But it has never explicitly committed to defending Taiwan militarily in the event of a Chinese attack. This ambiguity is both a policy tool and a source of ongoing debate among analysts and policymakers. In August 2022, then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, the highest-ranking American official to do so in 25 years. China responded with its largest military exercises near Taiwan since the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis of 1996. The People's Liberation Army conducted live-fire drills that effectively encircled the island, launched ballistic missiles that overflew Taiwan, and landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone, and crossed the informal median line that had previously divided the two sides' military activities in the strait. These exercises established what Chinese and Taiwanese analysts called a new normal for Chinese military operations near Taiwan: more aggressive, more frequent, more comprehensive. In December 2025, following a U.S. decision to approve an approximately $11 billion arms package to Taiwan. The largest single such package in history, China conducted another large-scale exercise around the island, codenamed Justice Mission 2025, involving ground, naval, and air forces of the People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command. The Taiwan question matters to Guam because, in the judgment of most serious strategic analysts, if there were ever a large-scale military conflict between the United States and China in the Pacific, it would almost certainly be triggered by or closely connected to the Taiwan issue. And in any such conflict, Guam would be a central node of American military response, and therefore a likely focus of Chinese strategic planning. This is not a comfortable thought to hold at midnight. Let us breathe through it and continue. Part 9. China's military transformation. Since the early 1990s, China has undergone the most dramatic military modernization of any major power in the post-Cold War era. This is a matter of documented fact, detailed in annual Pentagon assessments and confirmed by decades of open-source analysis. The catalyst for this transformation was, in part, the 1991 Gulf War, an event that China's military leadership watched with intense attention. The speed, precision, and overwhelming technological superiority of American forces in that conflict revealed the enormous gap between the People's Liberation Army's capabilities and those of the United States military. Chinese strategists drew a clear lesson. The existing force structure, built around massive infantry armies and short-range conventional capabilities, was wholly inadequate against a technologically advanced adversary. Over the following 3 decades, China invested enormous resources in modernizing and restructuring its military. Defense spending grew rapidly, far faster than the economy as a whole for much of this period, though as a percentage of GDP China's defense spending has remained lower than that of the United States. The People's Liberation Army Navy grew from a coastal defense force to a true blue-water fleet with aircraft carriers, advanced submarines, and destroyers capable of operating thousands of miles from Chinese shores. The People's Liberation Army Air Force developed and deployed advanced 4th and 5th generation fighter aircraft. And most significantly for the Guam question, the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, elevated to independent service status in 2015, developed the largest and most diverse arsenal of ground-based ballistic and cruise missiles in the world. Central to this missile arsenal is the DF-26. The Dongfeng 26, East Wind 26, is an intermediate-range ballistic missile first revealed at a military parade in September 2015 and confirmed to be in service with the Rocket Force in April 2018. It is a road-mobile, solid-fueled missile launched from transporter-erector launcher vehicles, meaning it can be moved around the country and fired from essentially any location, making it difficult to locate and eliminate before launch. Chinese sources claim the DF-26 has a range of over 5,000 kilometers, more than 3,100 miles, though other estimates place the range at approximately 4,000 kilometers for the baseline version. At these ranges, the missile can reach Guam from launcher positions throughout southern China. This is its strategic significance, and the reason Chinese media gave it the name Guam Killer almost immediately after its announcement. The DF-26 is also notable for being dual-capable. It can carry either a conventional high-explosive warhead or a nuclear warhead, and the warheads can be swapped relatively quickly. A 2024 Pentagon report on China's military estimated the PLA possessed 250 launchers for the DF-26 and approximately 500 missiles. In September 2025, China unveiled a new variant of this system, the DF-26D, during a military parade marking the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Details remain limited, but open-source analysts and defense publications report that the DF-26D may feature an extended range, improved guidance systems, and possibly a hypersonic glide vehicle that would make it more difficult to intercept. The emergence of this variant represents a continuation of China's systematic effort to hold at risk the American military infrastructure that sits on the second island chain. Beyond the missile forces, China has also developed what strategists call anti-access area denial capabilities, often abbreviated A2AD. The logic of A2AD is straightforward. Rather than trying to match the United States carrier for carrier or aircraft for aircraft, China has invested in capabilities designed to threaten and potentially neutralize American power projection in the Western Pacific, aircraft carriers, air bases, logistics hubs, so that the U.S. military would face enormous costs and risks in operating near Chinese territory in a conflict. Guam sits at the outer edge of this A2AD strategy, far enough away to be outside the reach of most Chinese systems, but now firmly within range of the DF-26 family. The United States, in response, has invested heavily in missile defense on Guam. The island has been described by Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, as his #1 priority for missile defense. The Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, known as THAAD, has been deployed to Guam to provide a layer of protection against ballistic missiles. Naval vessels equipped with SM-3 and SM-6 interceptors can provide additional layers of defense. The development of an integrated, layered missile defense architecture for Guam has been a major focus of Pentagon planning in recent years. But the fundamental strategic reality is unchanged. Guam is within range of Chinese missiles and has been since the DF-26 entered service. This is the context within which all discussions of Guam's strategic importance must now be understood. Part 10. The Pacific Web of Alliances. One of the most significant features of the strategic environment in the Pacific is that the United States does not stand alone. It is embedded in a dense network of alliances and partnerships that covers virtually every significant nation along the Pacific Rim, and these alliances profoundly shape the risk calculations of all parties. The foundational layer consists of 5 formal mutual defense treaties, with Japan, signed in 1951 and revised in 1960, with South Korea, signed in 1953, with the Philippines, signed in 1951, with Australia and New Zealand through the ANZ-US Treaty of 1951, and with Thailand through the Manila Pact of 1954. These treaties collectively commit the United States to treating armed attacks on its treaty partners as attacks requiring a response, and they commit the treaty partners to the same in the reverse case. Japan is by far the most significant of these allies in the Pacific context. Japan hosts the largest concentration of American military forces in Asia, including major air bases at Kadena in Okinawa and Misawa in the north, a naval base at Yokosuka, and approximately 55,000 U.S. military personnel in total. The U.S.-Japan alliance is the cornerstone of American security architecture in the Pacific. In the event of a conflict involving Taiwan, just 100 miles from Japan's western islands, Japan would be immediately affected, and this is something that Japanese leaders have increasingly acknowledged. Former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo famously stated that a Taiwan contingency would be a Japanese contingency, and current Japanese defense policy has been reshaped significantly by this recognition. Japan has committed to substantially increasing its defense budget, targeting roughly $321 billion in spending by 2027, a dramatic reversal of decades of deliberate defense restraint. The Philippines has emerged as an increasingly critical partner in recent years. Situated on the first island chain, with maritime boundaries in the South China Sea directly contested by China, the Philippines has experienced sustained Chinese pressure, vessel incursions, laser illumination of Philippine ships, water cannon attacks on resupply missions to Philippine-held islands. Under President Marcos, the Philippines expanded from 5 to 9 enhanced defense cooperation agreement sites where U.S. military forces may be stationed or prepositioned, many of them advantageously positioned to face Taiwan or the South China Sea. In 2023, the United States formally clarified that its mutual defense treaty with the Philippines applies to attacks on Philippine armed forces, vessels, and aircraft anywhere in the South China Sea. Australia, through the ANZ-US Treaty and the newer AUK-US partnership announced in 2021, provides crucial depth to American capabilities in the Pacific. AUK-US, a trilateral security arrangement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, is providing Australia with the technology and assistance to build conventionally armed, nuclear-powered submarines over the coming decades. These submarines will substantially enhance Australia's ability to operate in the deep Pacific and to provide a meaningful contribution to regional deterrence. Australia has also been expanding its cooperation with Japan, and joint exercises involving U.S., Japanese, Australian, and Philippine forces have become increasingly frequent. South Korea, while primarily focused on the North Korean threat, is a critical element of the overall alliance structure. It hosts approximately 28,500 American troops, an air force with advanced capabilities, and a growing navy. Public opinion in South Korea has shifted substantially in a more anti-China direction in recent years. A 2024 poll showed 71% of South Koreans holding an unfavorable view of China, which makes deeper involvement in Pacific security cooperation increasingly politically viable. Beyond the formal treaty allies, the United States has developed extensive security partnerships with India, Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, and others. The Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue involving the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, has become an increasingly significant multilateral forum for coordinating on security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, including shared maritime domain awareness, technology cooperation, and infrastructure investment as alternatives to Chinese Belt and Road projects. This network of alliances and partnerships is the single greatest asymmetric advantage the United States holds in its strategic competition with China. China's closest partnerships, with Russia, North Korea, and Iran, are far less militarily capable and considerably more politically problematic. The breadth and depth of the American alliance system means that any conflict in the Pacific would not simply be a bilateral U.S.-China confrontation, but would almost immediately involve multiple nations across a vast geographic area. This reality is itself a powerful deterrent. The sheer complexity and unpredictability of a conflict involving Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and potentially others, combined with the nuclear dimensions discussed below, means that rational actors on all sides have extraordinarily powerful incentives to avoid direct military confrontation. Part 11. The Grammar of Deterrence. We have arrived at what is perhaps the most important concept for understanding why, despite all the tension and all the strategic competition, the Pacific has not descended into large-scale war. The concept is deterrence, and specifically nuclear deterrence, a subject that sounds forbidding but is, at its core, a relatively simple and even elegant piece of strategic logic. Deterrence theory holds that you can prevent an adversary from taking an undesirable action not by defeating them after they take it, but by threatening consequences that make the action not worth taking in the first place. The threat must be credible, the adversary must genuinely believe you would follow through, and the consequences must be severe enough to outweigh whatever benefit the adversary hopes to gain. The specific form of deterrence that has governed great power relations since the 1950s is nuclear deterrence, and its central doctrine is called mutual assured destruction, abbreviated in the rather apt acronym MAD. The logic goes like this. if both sides in a conflict possess nuclear weapons in sufficient numbers and with sufficient survivability, meaning they cannot all be destroyed in a first strike, then each side knows that a nuclear attack on the other will result in a devastating nuclear counterattack on itself. The outcome is the annihilation of both parties. Therefore, neither side will rationally launch a nuclear strike because the cost is unacceptable. This logic sounds circular, and in a sense it is. It is a game-theoretic equilibrium. Once both sides are armed, neither has an incentive to fire first, and neither has an incentive to disarm unilaterally. The stability comes from the very grimness of the guaranteed outcome. It is, as the acronym suggests, a kind of organized madness that happens to prevent the thing it describes. During the Cold War, this logic governed the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union with remarkable effectiveness. Despite profound ideological hostility, direct military confrontation, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when nuclear war came as close as it has ever come, was ultimately avoided. Both sides stepped back from the brink, because both understood, viscerally and institutionally, that the alternative was civilizational destruction. The situation in the Pacific today involves more complex nuclear calculations than the bipolar Cold War standoff. China's nuclear arsenal has been growing significantly. A 2023 Pentagon report estimated that China could possess 1,000 operational nuclear warheads by 2030, still substantially smaller than the American or Russian arsenals, but sufficient for a credible deterrent. China maintains an official, no first-use policy, a declared commitment not to be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict, though American strategists debate the reliability of this commitment under all circumstances. The dual-capable nature of the DF-26, able to carry either nuclear or conventional warheads, with the warhead swappable, introduces particular complexity. If Chinese DF-26 missiles were launched toward Guam in a hypothetical conflict and American commanders could not determine whether the incoming warheads were conventional or nuclear, the decision-making pressure would be enormous. This ambiguity, what the Defense Intelligence Agency has called the commingling of nuclear and conventional capabilities, raises the potential for inadvertent escalation in ways that the simpler Cold War US-Soviet dynamic did not. The cold logic of nuclear deterrence, then, is simultaneously a stabilizing force and a source of ongoing concern. It prevents large-scale war, but the mechanisms by which it does so involve existential risks and decision timelines that are deeply uncomfortable to contemplate. And it creates an environment in which both sides invest continuously in systems designed to improve their deterrent posture, which generates its own arms race dynamics and security dilemmas. This is the world's strategic reality, and understanding it honestly requires holding two thoughts simultaneously. The world's nuclear-armed great powers are, by virtue of the deterrent logic, unlikely to fight each other directly, and the mechanisms that prevent that outcome involve the most dangerous weapons ever created. It is, as many analysts have observed, a peace that is both durable and permanently precarious. Part 12. Hypothetical scenarios clearly labeled. Having established the factual and strategic context with care, let us now consider, with this clearly labeled as speculative and hypothetical, what academic and policy analysts have discussed when thinking through the potential escalation pathways that could conceivably bring the Pacific to a moment of crisis. Everything in this section is hypothetical, speculative analysis based on published academic and policy research. No claim is made that these scenarios will happen or are likely to happen. They are presented as an exercise in understanding strategic logic. The scenario most frequently discussed in academic and policy circles begins not with Guam but with Taiwan. Most analysts agree that the most plausible pathway to a major Pacific conflict runs through a Chinese military move against Taiwan. Whether a blockade designed to strangle the island economically, a seizure of smaller Taiwan-controlled islands, or a direct amphibious assault on the main island. In such a scenario, the United States would face an immediate and agonizing decision, whether and how to intervene. The strategic ambiguity policy is precisely designed to preserve decision space in this moment, to avoid committing to a course of action in advance that might either encourage Taiwanese provocations or signal American non-intervention in ways that reduce deterrence. But in a real crisis, that ambiguity would have to resolve into actual choices under enormous time pressure. Academic wargames and Rand Corporation studies conducted over the past decade have consistently found that a U.S. military response to a Chinese action against Taiwan would be extraordinarily costly and the outcome deeply uncertain. The proximity of Chinese air and naval forces to Taiwan, the maturation of China's anti-access area denial capabilities, and the vulnerability of American bases in the first island chain, particularly at Kadena in Okinawa, all present severe challenges to American power projection in the immediate vicinity of the conflict. Guam's role in this hypothetical would be as a staging and support base for American forces operating at greater distance, beyond the immediate reach of most Chinese systems, but within range of bombers and long-range strike aircraft that could operate in the broader theater. It would also serve as a logistics and maintenance hub for naval forces operating in the Philippine Sea and Western Pacific. Hypothetically, in such a scenario, a rational Chinese military planner would need to consider whether American operations from Guam could be disrupted or degraded in ways that affected the overall military balance. This is precisely the strategic problem that the DF-26 and its successors are designed to address, to hold Guam at risk as a deterrent and potential warfighting tool. American planners, aware of this threat, have developed a concept called agile combat employment, dispersing aircraft and capabilities across multiple locations rather than concentrating them at predictable fixed bases. The idea is that if Guam becomes a target, aircraft can be dispersed to Palau, to Tinian, to Wake Island, to Allied bases in Japan and Australia, making any attempt to degrade American air power more difficult and more costly. The development of Camp Blaz on Guam and the investment in infrastructure across the Pacific are part of this broader effort to create a more resilient, distributed military posture. But the fundamental conclusion of most academic analyses is that the costs of a major U.S.-China conflict in the Pacific, for both sides, and for the global economy and international order, would be so enormous that rational actors have overwhelming incentives to find alternatives to direct military confrontation. The deterrent logic holds, at least for now. End of hypothetical scenario section. Part 13. The economic world at stake. One of the most powerful arguments against major conflict between the United States and China, beyond the nuclear dimension, is the sheer scale of the economic interdependence between the two countries and the economic damage that any serious conflict would inflict on the entire global system. The United States and China are the two largest economies in the world by nominal gross domestic product. Together, as of 2025, they account for approximately 44.2% of global nominal GDP. The trading relationship between them, while strained by tariffs and strategic competition, remains enormous, hundreds of billions of dollars in goods and services crossing the Pacific annually. American consumers depend on Chinese manufacturing for countless products. Chinese factories depend on American technology, American demand, and access to global financial systems. The interconnection of supply chains across both economies and their mutual dependence on the same global trade infrastructure creates a web of mutual vulnerability. Any serious military conflict would not just affect the two belligerents. The South China Sea alone carries approximately 1/5 to 1/3 of all global maritime trade, including critical energy supplies to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. A conflict in the Pacific, Even a limited one would disrupt shipping lanes, spike insurance rates, send energy prices soaring, and trigger financial market turbulence that would reverberate in every economy from Frankfurt to Sao Paulo to Johannesburg. The Taiwan semiconductor question adds another dimension. Taiwan produces a disproportionate share of the world's most advanced logic chips, the processors that power AI systems, data centers, military electronics, and consumer devices. In 2021, a global chip shortage caused by COVID-related disruptions demonstrated just how fragile the semiconductor supply chain is, and how rapidly the absence of chips can cascade through manufacturing industries worldwide. A major conflict that disrupted Taiwan's chip production would cause economic damage that analysts have estimated could reach into the trillions of dollars, a figure that dwarfs virtually any conceivable military objective. These economic realities have sometimes been described as making war unthinkable, but this is too strong. War has often been fought between nations with significant economic ties, including, notably, the major European powers in 1914, who were deeply enmeshed in trade and investment relationships at the outbreak of World War I. Economic interdependence reduces the incentive for conflict, but does not eliminate it. What it does is raise the cost calculations enormously, adding another powerful argument to the deterrence ledger. The trade tensions between the United States and China that have escalated since 2018, tariffs, technology export controls, investment restrictions, competition for influence in third countries, represent a form of economic conflict that falls well short of military confrontation, but carries real costs. They reflect the fundamental tension between two economic models and two visions of how the international economic order should be organized. This economic dimension of the US-China competition is likely to persist regardless of what happens on the military side, and it too contributes to the pressures that both sides are managing. Part 14. Why major powers don't go to war. We have spent considerable time tracing the contours of tension and risk in the Pacific. Let us close the analytical arc by returning to the most important and reassuring conclusion that the evidence supports. Major nuclear-armed powers have extraordinarily strong reasons not to go to war with each other, and the historical record since 1945 offers 80 years of evidence that this logic, despite all its instabilities and precariousness, has held. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union lasted more than 4 decades. It involved proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, and many other theaters. It involved nuclear near misses, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the Able Archer exercise scare in 1983, when Soviet intelligence almost convinced the Kremlin that a NATO exercise was the prelude to a real nuclear attack. It involved sustained espionage, ideological competition, arms races, and genuine, deep mutual hostility. And yet, American and Soviet forces never directly fired on each other, not once in 40 years. This is a remarkable achievement of deterrence. It came at an enormous cost in human lives, treasure, and moral clarity. The proxy wars killed millions of people. It was often maintained by decisions and luck in roughly equal measure, but it held. The US-China relationship, for all its tensions, operates within a similar deterrence structure. Both sides have nuclear weapons. Both sides have demonstrated the capacity for second-strike retaliation, submarines at sea, mobile missile launchers, hardened silos. Both sides understand that a nuclear exchange between them would be catastrophic and terminal in historical terms, and both sides have enormous economic stakes in a peaceful Pacific. The leadership of China, whatever its ambitions and frustrations, is not suicidal. The leadership of the United States, whatever its concerns about Chinese power, is not reckless. There are scenarios that could override these calculations: miscalculation, crisis escalation, domestic political pressures that constrain decision-makers, accidents, and misunderstandings that trigger responses before anyone fully understands what has happened. These risks are real and deserve serious attention, which is exactly why scholars, strategists, and policymakers spend so much time analyzing them. Understanding the risks is the first step toward managing them. But the baseline conclusion of the evidence is not alarmist. It is, in fact, somewhat reassuring. The world has not had a war between great powers since 1945. The Pacific, despite its tensions, has not descended into major conflict. Diplomacy, deterrence, economic interdependence, and the catastrophic memory of the last World War have together maintained a peace that, for all its fragility, has endured for 8 decades. Guam sits in the middle of all of this, a small, beautiful, complicated island that carries enormous strategic weight, inhabited by people with a long and resilient history. The bases there are not symbols of belligerence, but of deterrence. Their purpose is to make conflict less likely, not more. The fact that China has developed missiles capable of reaching Guam does not mean war is inevitable. It means that both sides are engaged in the ancient and dangerous game of signaling capability and resolve, the same game that was played across the Iron Curtain for 40 years without a direct shot being fired. Part 14b. Lessons from the Long Cold War. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union lasted from roughly 1947 to 1991. 44 years of sustained strategic competition between two nuclear-armed superpowers with incompatible ideological visions and genuine, deep mutual hostility. It is the most historically relevant precedent for understanding the current U.S.-China competition, and the lessons it offers are both sobering and, ultimately, somewhat encouraging. The Cold War was not, at its height, a polite competition. It involved the Korean War, in which American and Chinese forces fought directly, and more than 36,000 Americans were killed, along with hundreds of thousands of Koreans on both sides, and a significant though uncertain number of Chinese soldiers. It involved the Vietnam War, in which more than 58,000 Americans died in a conflict heavily influenced by Cold War dynamics. It involved the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, in which American and Soviet leaders came closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in the nuclear age. A confrontation that was resolved only through a combination of careful diplomacy, back-channel communication, and a willingness on both sides to accept compromises that neither publicly announced. It is worth dwelling briefly on the Cuban Missile Crisis, because it is both a cautionary tale and, ultimately, a hopeful one. In October 1962, American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft discovered Soviet ballistic missile installations under construction in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast. President Kennedy and his advisors spent 13 days managing a crisis that brought the world, in the words of Secretary of State Dean Rusk, eyeball to eyeball with nuclear war. The resolution, Soviet missiles withdrawn from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba, and a secret agreement to withdraw American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, required back-channel communication through intermediaries, deliberate ambiguity, and a willingness by both Kennedy and Khrushchev to accept outcomes they could frame as acceptable to their domestic constituencies even if they involved real concessions. It worked. The missiles were removed. Nuclear war was avoided. One of the most important lessons of the Cold War is that crises can be managed even when the stakes are existential, provided that decision-makers on both sides retain agency, preserve communication channels, and are willing to de-escalate. The United States and Soviet Union, after the missile crisis, established the famous hotline, a direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin, precisely to ensure that a future crisis would not be escalated by miscommunication or the absence of contact. Equivalent mechanisms between the United States and China have been developed over the years, including high-level military communication channels, though these have periodically been suspended during periods of heightened tension, and then laboriously reestablished. Another lesson is that systems of mutual deterrence, while stable at the macro level, can be destabilized by technological change. The Soviet development of multiple, independently targetable reentry vehicles, MIRV technology, which allowed a single missile to carry and deliver multiple warheads to separate targets, changed the strategic calculus in ways that required new arms control agreements and new doctrine. The development of hypersonic glide vehicles today represents a similar kind of technological disruption, a new capability that outpaces existing defensive systems and requires adjustment of both strategy and arms control frameworks. The fact that no arms control agreement currently covers Chinese intermediate-range ballistic missiles, because China was never party to the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, is a genuine gap in the architecture of strategic stability. The Cold War also demonstrated the importance of maintaining non-military channels of engagement, even during periods of intense military competition. The Helsinki Accords of 1975, which established a framework for human rights and security confidence-building measures between the Western Alliance and the Soviet bloc, were a product of détente, a period in which strategic competition was managed alongside diplomatic engagement. The ability to separate military and diplomatic tracks, to compete vigorously on some dimensions while maintaining dialogue on others, proved to be essential for keeping the competition from spiraling out of control. In the current U.S.-China context, the maintenance of military-to-military communication channels, even when political relations are strained, is similarly important. The risk of a military incident escalating, a collision of ships or aircraft, a misidentified signal, a commander in the field making a decision that neither government intended, is real in an environment where both sides operate at close proximity across contested waters and airspace. The resumption of military-to-military dialogue after periods of suspension is always a positive signal, not because such dialogues resolve the underlying strategic competition, but because they reduce the risk of accidents and misunderstandings that could escalate beyond anyone's intent. The Cold War ended not with a bang but, in some sense, with a conversation. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, the collapse of communist governments across Eastern Europe, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself were driven by internal dynamics: economic stagnation, political illegitimacy, the exhaustion of a system that could no longer deliver on its promises to its people. The United States did not defeat the Soviet Union in battle. It outlasted a system that was ultimately unsustainable. Whether a similar dynamic will eventually resolve the U.S.-China competition is an open question. China's political system is different from the late Soviet system in important ways, and its economic performance has been substantially stronger for longer. The outcome of the current competition is genuinely uncertain, which is one of the reasons it demands such careful attention. But the precedent of the Cold War, competition managed without catastrophe, ultimately resolved through internal transformation of one of the competitors, offers at least one historical pathway to a peaceful outcome. The key variables, as they were during the Cold War, are the choices made by leaders on both sides in moments of crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis might have ended differently had Kennedy not insisted on a blockade rather than an airstrike, had Khrushchev not found a way to frame withdrawal as anything other than capitulation, had the submarine commanders who received what they believed were attack orders not chosen to surface and verify rather than fire. The architecture of deterrence provides stability at the structural level, but the specific outcomes in specific crises depend on human judgment, human courage, and sometimes human luck. This is the world into which the island of Guam is embedded, a world shaped by enormous structural forces but ultimately navigated by human beings, making imperfect decisions under uncertainty, trying to avoid the worst outcomes while protecting what they value. It has worked, so far. The work of making it continue to work is ongoing. Part 15. The Island at Peace. Imagine Guam at midnight. The ocean surrounds it on all sides, black and vast, broken only by the white lines of surf against the reef. The trade winds move through the palm trees. Somewhere to the north, on the limestone plateau, the runway lights of Andersen Air Force Base glow faintly, a long, straight line of blue and white in the dark. Further south, in the deeper harbor of Apra, the silhouettes of naval vessels sit motionless in the still water, their lights reflecting in broken ripples. In the villages, Dedido and Yigo and Mangilao, in Tamuning and Hagatnya, families sleep. Children breathe slowly in their beds. Dogs lie on porches. The stars overhead are extraordinary here, far from the light pollution of the mainland. The Milky Way visible in all its depth. The Southern Cross visible at this latitude, familiar constellations of the Pacific sky. The Chamorro people have been sleeping on this island for 4,000 years. Through Spanish missions and naval administrations, through Japanese occupation and American liberation, through Cold War and island chain strategy, through B-52s and DF-26s and diplomatic negotiations and wargame simulations. Through all of it, they have lived here, raised children here, buried their dead here, maintained their language and their food and their extended families, and their fierce and quiet sense of belonging to this particular piece of the earth. That continuity is something. The geopolitical dramas that orbit this island, the great power competition, the missile calculations, the alliance management, the deterrence theory, all of this matters enormously. It shapes the safety of the world. But it is worth remembering in the small hours of the morning that at the center of all strategic calculations there are always human beings, living their lives in particular places, on particular islands, under particular stars. Guam is not just a base. It is a home. It has always been a home for the people whose ancestors first paddled to its shores in canoes, for the American service members who rotate through and find the sunsets extraordinary and the water warm, for the Filipino workers who staff the hotels in Tuman Bay, for the families who have been here through everything. The strategic story of Guam is ultimately the story of how small places carry enormous weight in the logic of great power competition, and how the people who live in those places navigate that weight with more grace than anyone in a strategy paper usually notices. Part 11b. The Stability-Instability Paradox and New Complications. There is a concept in strategic studies called the Stability-Instability Paradox, and it is worth understanding because it illuminates one of the most counterintuitive features of the nuclear age. The paradox works like this. The existence of nuclear weapons at the strategic level, the level at which cities and civilizations are threatened, creates enormous stability between nuclear powers. Neither side will risk an action that could lead to strategic nuclear exchange. But this very stability at the highest level can create more room for conflict at lower levels. If both sides know that strategic nuclear war is off the table because its costs are mutually catastrophic, they may feel freer to compete through conventional military operations, proxy conflicts, economic pressure, and gray zone activities, all of which stop short of the threshold that would trigger nuclear escalation. A study published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution in 2009 found quantitative support for exactly this pattern. Nuclear weapons promote strategic stability and prevent large-scale wars, but simultaneously allow for more low-intensity conflicts. The Cold War itself was a vivid illustration. The United States and Soviet Union fought each other constantly, through proxies and at the margins, but never directly. In the Pacific today, this paradox manifests in the gray zone activities that China has conducted around Taiwan, in the South China Sea, and elsewhere. The near-daily sorties of Chinese military aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, the water cannon attacks on Philippine resupply vessels near contested reefs, the laser illumination of ships and aircraft, the militarization of artificial islands. All of these are activities that are designed to change facts on the ground and signal Chinese determination, while staying below the threshold that would trigger a significant military response. They are, in a sense, the strategic freedom created by the stability of mutual nuclear deterrence. Managing this gray zone is one of the central challenges of Pacific security policy. American and allied responses need to be firm enough to deter further Chinese pressure and reassure partners, but calibrated carefully enough not to escalate in ways that could spiral toward direct confrontation. It is a difficult balance, and it is made more difficult by the fact that multiple actors in Washington, in Beijing, in Taipei, in Tokyo, in Manila, all have their own political pressures and red lines, and the system does not have a single coherent decision-making authority that can guarantee consistent, carefully calibrated responses. Another complication that has emerged in recent years is the development of hypersonic glide vehicles, weapons that travel at speeds of 5 or more times the speed of sound, while maneuvering in ways that make them difficult to track and intercept. China has been described by American defense officials as the world's current leader in hypersonic technology. The integration of hypersonic glide vehicles onto ballistic missile systems, like the DF-26D, complicates the work of American missile defense planners. Because the existing interceptor systems were designed primarily against traditional ballistic missile trajectories, predictable arcs through the upper atmosphere. A maneuvering hypersonic vehicle following an unpredictable path at extreme speed is a fundamentally different interception challenge. This does not mean American missile defenses are useless. They remain a meaningful layer of protection, and the investment in Guam's integrated defense architecture reflects serious work on exactly this problem. But it does illustrate the ongoing arms race dynamic in which capabilities and countermeasures continue to evolve in response to each other, with no stable endpoint in sight. Cyber capabilities add yet another dimension to the strategic picture. Both the United States and China have developed sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities, and both sides engage in persistent cyber operations against each other's military networks, government systems, and critical infrastructure. In any real crisis, cyber operations would almost certainly precede and accompany conventional military action, creating additional uncertainty and escalation risk. The extent to which cyber attacks on military systems might be interpreted as acts of war, and the thresholds for response, are areas of genuine ambiguity in international law and strategic doctrine, another source of the miscalculation risk that strategists worry about. Part 13b. The deep roots of U.S.-China economic interdependence. The economic relationship between the United States and China deserves a more granular look, because its scale is genuinely difficult to comprehend in abstract terms. As of the mid-2020s, despite years of trade tensions, tariffs, and deliberate decoupling efforts, the United States and China remain deeply enmeshed economically. The United States imports enormous quantities of Chinese-manufactured goods, electronics, clothing, furniture, industrial components, while China's export-oriented manufacturing sector depends heavily on access to American markets and increasingly on American technology, even as Washington works to restrict that access. Chinese holdings of American Treasury bonds, while reduced from their peak, still represent a significant stake in American financial stability. The trade war that began under President Trump in 2018, with successive waves of tariffs on Chinese goods, imposed real costs on both economies, but it demonstrated the limits of economic coercion as a strategic tool. Research by economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research found that American consumers largely bore the cost of the tariffs through higher prices, rather than the burden being absorbed by Chinese exporters. China's exports fell in some categories but rose in others, and global trade networks adjusted as third countries stepped in to fill gaps. The technology competition is, in some ways, the more consequential dimension. American export controls on advanced semiconductors and the equipment used to manufacture them, particularly the Dutch ASML extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that are essential for making the most advanced chips, have attempted to slow China's development of leading-edge chip manufacturing capabilities. China has responded by massively increasing its investment in domestic semiconductor development, aiming for self-sufficiency in a sector it previously relied on foreign technology to supply. This technology competition has a directly military dimension. The most advanced weapons systems, stealth aircraft, precision missiles, command and control networks, artificial intelligence-enabled warfare capabilities, all depend on access to the most advanced semiconductors. Whoever controls the leading edge of semiconductor technology has a meaningful advantage in the military competition as well as in the commercial economy. This is why the chip industry, and Taiwan's central role in it, carries such extraordinary strategic weight. Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, universally known as TSMC, produces the majority of the world's most advanced logic chips. The processors that power the artificial intelligence systems, data centers, and high-performance computers on which both the civilian economy and advanced military systems increasingly depend. TSMC's foundries on Taiwan are not simply commercial facilities. They are, in the judgment of many analysts, among the most strategically significant industrial assets on Earth. Disrupting TSMC's production would send shockwaves through every technology company in the world and every military relying on modern electronics. This creates a peculiar and darkly ironic element in the Taiwan security equation. China cannot seize Taiwan and then expect to continue operating TSMC's most advanced facilities, because those facilities depend on a constant supply of foreign equipment, chemicals, and expertise that would immediately be cut off in the event of a Chinese invasion. The economic logic works, in a strange way, as an additional deterrent against the most extreme scenarios. The interconnection of the two economies does not make war impossible, as history has repeatedly shown, but it raises the cost calculations enormously. A serious U.S.-China military conflict would not just damage the two belligerents, it would fracture the global economy in ways that would be felt for decades. This is another powerful reason why rational actors on both sides have strong incentives to manage their competition through means short of military confrontation. Part 15b. The Human Geography of a Pacific Crossroads. There is something we should say about the texture of daily life on Guam before we drift towards sleep, because no strategic analysis is complete without remembering that the places we discuss are places where people actually live. Guam's economy has two dominant pillars: the American military and tourism, primarily from Japan and other Asian countries. The relationship between those two pillars is something of a study in productive contrasts. On the northern end of the island, behind fences and security checkpoints, stretch the bases, enormous, functional, oriented toward power and capability. On the western coast, in the village of Tumen, the hotel strip faces a long, curving bay of turquoise water that is one of the most beautiful stretches of beach in the western Pacific, lined with luxury hotels, restaurants, duty-free shops, and the paraphernalia of Japanese and Korean tourism. More than 1 million tourists visited Guam annually before the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted travel patterns. The majority were Japanese, a remarkable fact given the history of Japanese occupation during World War II. The transformation of the relationship between Japan and Guam, from one of brutal occupation to one of the most popular tourist destinations for Japanese travelers, represents one of the more striking cases of historical reconciliation in the Pacific. Guamanians serve in the U.S. military at a per capita rate that is among the highest of any American jurisdiction. The island sends a greater proportion of its young people into military service than the vast majority of American states, a statistic that reflects both economic opportunity and a deep cultural connection to service and to the American national project, formed partly through the experience of liberation in 1944. The military service rate also reflects the genuine and complex nature of Guamanian identity, American in citizenship, Chamorro in culture, Pacific in geography, and defined partly by a history in which the American military was both an occupying power and, in the darkest moment, a liberating force. The political status of Guam remains a subject of ongoing discussion. Guamanians cannot vote in U.S. presidential elections unless they have established mainland residency, a persistent and real limitation on their political participation in the federal government, whose laws they live under and whose military they serve in. Some Guamanians advocate for statehood. Others explore decolonization pathways. Most navigate the current arrangement with a pragmatic acceptance of its benefits and frustrations. The Chamorro decolonization movement, while not dominant in popular polling, a 1982 referendum saw more than 75% of voters choose closer ties with the United States, reflects a genuine desire for self-determination that deserves acknowledgement in any serious discussion of the island. The Chamorro language is taught in schools and spoken in many homes, even as English dominates commerce and education. Chamorro food, red rice cooked with achiati seeds, keleng, a dish of marinated meat or seafood, pancit noodles showing the Filipino influence, fresh fish grilled in banana leaves, the rice flour tortillas called tidillas, is a living expression of a culture that has absorbed 4 centuries of outside influence without losing its core identity. This is what strategic geography is, at its most human. An island is not just a piece of land with runways and fuel tanks. It is a community with a history that reaches back 4,000 years, a cuisine that reflects 4 different colonial experiences, a language that survived everything colonialism threw at it, and people who wake up every morning and make coffee and take children to school and go to work and come home and watch the sun go down over the Philippine Sea, and who are, in all of this, precisely as human as anyone listening to these words in the dark. Part 15c, the Pacific at night. Let us move more slowly now. The analysis is complete. The facts are laid out. The logic of deterrence and diplomacy has been traced. What remains is the Pacific itself. The Pacific Ocean covers more than 60 million square miles, more than all the Earth's landmasses combined. At its greatest width, it spans more than 12,000 miles. The distances involved in Pacific strategy are almost incomprehensible from the perspective of a continent-bound imagination. The 5,800 miles between San Francisco and Guam represent a transit of nearly 12 hours by jet aircraft. For a cargo ship, it takes weeks. This ocean has been a highway, a barrier, a battlefield, and a graveyard. The bones of American and Japanese soldiers and sailors rest on its floor, on its atolls, in its jungles. The story of the 20th century's most destructive war was written in large part across these waters and these islands. And tonight, it is quiet. The Mariana Trench plunges down into its impossible depth, 7 miles below the surface, in water so cold and dark and pressure-crushed that the organisms living there are among the strangest on Earth, translucent creatures, bioluminescent, adapted to conditions that would kill everything familiar in seconds. Above them, the ocean is warm and blue, filled with the kinds of fish and coral that draw divers from around the world. The trade winds that Ferdinand Magellan rode across this ocean in 1521, the winds that carried the galleons of the Manila trade for 200 years, the winds that cooled the cockpits of American pilots and the rifle barrels of Chamorro fighters in 1944, those same winds are moving across the Pacific tonight, unhurried, as they always have. Guam is out there, a small green shape in all that blue, its light visible from ships at sea. The stars above it are the same stars that the first Chamorro navigators used to find their way across the Pacific. The Pleiades, which the Chamorros called Matapang, meaning the constellation that guides, were used for navigation and for marking the agricultural calendar. The Southern Cross, visible from this latitude, provided bearing in the night sky. People have always used the stars to find their way. Part 16. What the Dawn Brings. As the night deepens, and as your breathing slows, let us consider what the logic of all this analysis actually points toward. The Pacific is not a theater of war. It is, as it has been for the past 80 years, a theater of deterrence, a vast space in which enormous military power is maintained precisely so that it need not be used. The tensions are real. The risks are real. The competition between the United States and China for influence, technological supremacy, and regional order is one of the defining dynamics of our era. But the instruments of this competition are, for now, primarily economic, diplomatic, and technological, not military. The alliances that the United States has maintained since the 1950s, with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, have proven to be genuine sources of stability. They provide collective deterrence that no single nation could achieve alone. The network of relationships, exercises, agreements, and shared interests that these alliances represent is far more durable than any individual weapons system. Taiwan's status remains uncertain and disputed, and will likely remain so for the foreseeable future. But decades of experience suggest that the mechanisms of deterrence and diplomacy can manage this uncertainty without it cascading into catastrophe. The preference of all rational actors, including, ultimately, Beijing, is for stability, not for a conflict whose costs would be measured in devastation on a civilizational scale. Guam's role in all of this is to serve as what it has always served as, a tangible expression of American reach and commitment. Its bases say, to any potential adversary in the Pacific, that the United States is present, capable, and prepared to honor its commitments. This signal is valuable precisely because it is maintained continuously, in peacetime, making it less likely that it ever has to be acted on in war. The DF-26 missile, the Guam killer, represents China's answer to this signal, its own declaration of capability, its own deterrent message. And the fact that both messages have been received, understood, and factored into the calculations of both sides is, in a strange way, evidence that deterrence is working. Both sides know the costs. Both sides are adjusting their behavior accordingly. This is how the world works, at the edge of the Pacific, in the shadow of the deepest ocean trench on Earth, on an island of 210 square miles where people have been living for 4,000 years, and where the coconut palms still sway in the trade winds at midnight. Closing thoughts. You have traveled a long way tonight, across the Pacific, through 4,000 years of Chamorro history, through the Spanish galleon trade and American naval administration, through the horror of Japanese occupation and the extraordinary liberation of July 21, 1944, through the Cold War and the island chain strategy and the logic of mutual assured destruction, through the long arc of U.S.-China relations from the hostility of 1950, through the rapprochement of 1972 to the strategic competition of today, through the Taiwan question and the South China Sea and the DF-26 and the vast web of Pacific alliances, through the hypothetical scenarios that defense planners lose sleep over, and through the deeper logic that keeps those scenarios from becoming reality. What you have encountered tonight is not a story of inevitable catastrophe. It is a story of extraordinary complexity, managed imperfectly but persistently by the slow machinery of deterrence, diplomacy, economic interdependence, and the accumulated wisdom of people who have seen, in living memory, what large-scale war actually costs. The world is not simple, the Pacific is not calm, but it is tonight at peace. And the small island of Guam is asleep under its stars, the surf breaking against the reef in the dark, the trade winds moving through the palms, and the people who have called this place home since long before any empire arrived continuing to live their lives, resilient, specific, human. Let your thoughts drift. Let the weight of all those names and dates and distances settle gently. You don't need to hold any of it now. You absorbed it. It will be there when you wake up, stored somewhere quiet in the landscape of what you know about the world. Breathe in slowly. Hold it for just a moment. And let it go. The Pacific is vast, the night is long, and you are safe wherever you are in the warm dark of this moment. Sleep well. If this journey through Pacific history and strategy helped you find a little quiet tonight, we would be so grateful if you would take a moment when you wake up to leave a like on this video. It's a small thing, but it genuinely helps Future Slumber reach more people who are looking for this kind of deep, slow, thoughtful content to help them rest. And if you found a place here where you could unwind and let the world be explained at a pace that actually lets you breathe, please subscribe to Future Slumber. Every week we explore new corners of history, geopolitics, science, and culture, always with the same unhurried voice, always at the pace of the tide coming in. We'll be here when you need us in the small hours, with the lights low and the world made a little more knowable. Good night.